What's up, Wildside besties and baddies? I'm Bailey.
And I'm Chelsea, and we're here to walk you through the wild sides.
From homicides to hosticides and everything in between.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
All right, Wildsiders. Today, we are so excited to welcome Miss Melissa Corter. She is an international best-selling author, a depth psychologist, a researcher, a certified hypnotherapist, and consultant. And we are going to hopefully do a lot more listening than we will talking, because I, for one, do not know a whole bunch about this field of study. And I am so excited to hear about who you are, what you do, and all the things, Melissa. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and honored to share with both of you, and looking forward to the conversation. It's wonderful anytime we get to talk about these topics and bring some insight and information.
Yes.
Yeah. I am personally stoked. I think I'm going to be almost like a listener. It's like almost a blind interview, in all honesty, because Chelsea and I, we obviously, have read your description and and know the bullet points to your expertise. But I honestly still have no idea what this means and what you do. And all I saw like catchwords. I was like dark psychologist, and then dark, and then psychopathy, and like nightmares. And I was like, this is the most interesting thing I've ever seen. And so could you kind of just give like your spiel to speak to the general population who has no understanding of what this is and what you do?
Absolutely. So I like to say that the short version is I study the dark part of the mind, the dark side of the human psyche. And essentially what that means is I look for hidden patterns. I look for the things that are out of sight, out of mind. I look for researching different ways that we operate through compulsions, through instincts, through things that are happening beneath the surface of our awareness. And some of the ways that I sort of track and trace those patterns is by looking at these really difficult types of materials. So that might be certain crime cases and the patterns and the behaviors that we find really abhorrent or difficult to understand or fathom. Especially things that are really, we're quick to label as evil. And usually it's because there's a lack of information there. Maybe it's something we haven't seen. It's something we don't know how to process. I call them like doorways, essentially. But another way into this dark side of the human psyche is through studying nightmares. So there's patterns of behavior. There's personality characteristics such as psychopathy and narcissism. There's the actual rituals of crimes and things like that too. But it all comes back to the capacity we all have to get lost within these different parts of us. And the more that we understand, the more we try to recognize we have a dark side, even if we aren't the same as some of the people that are committing these horrific, terrible crimes. There's something we can learn about ourselves by studying those behaviors. And it's not about being dismissive to the terrible nature of them as well. We're not glorifying criminals. We're not trying to celebrate these individuals that people sometimes fawn over in really strange ways. In fact, that in itself is a behavior we can learn from. But I find it fascinating because I think that, as a kid, I was always the weird one, and I always wanted to know why and what and how. And I realized, like, wow, people are afraid. And when we're afraid, we don't look. And when we don't look, we miss things, we miss opportunities. And so, yeah, I'm fascinated as well as I continue to dive in and see where the work goes.
That is the coolest thing.
It really is. And, so Bailey and I both work in school settings. I was working with some 8th graders, and I recently asked, what is the one quote unquote weird thing? What is the weirdest thing you've learned in school? And the majority of the kids who said, what their weird thing was was that they read this book. So right now at the school that my kids go to, they read a book in 7th grade called How They Croaked. And it is how, yeah, it is, it's called How They Croaked. And it is a
She's
book
writing
that
it down. I
tells you,
love
yeah,
this so much.
it is a book that tells you how famous historic figures, how they died. You know, George Washington or Edgar Allan Poe or whatever else. And all of them, I mean, they gobble this stuff up. They will read through this book. Like the teachers have to tell them to not read ahead. So when you were talking about, like, I was that weird one in school, I really appreciate the fact, number one, that you have the vulnerability to say that. But number two, I am appreciating the fact that our educational system is opening their eyes to some of this quote unquote morbid curiosity, because I do feel like that's a natural thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that is part of the journey that I've had. Is I had all those interests, and I realized there's so many people now as an adult in my world where they're like, me too, me too. You know, it's, I felt that way as a child, or I also was drawn to really dark, interesting, strange things. But when you're going through it, you don't realize that there is such a thing as a healthy level, that morbid curiosity. And so sometimes we'll like sort of shield that part of ourselves when there's enormous value there. So I wrote that down right away. I was like, I've got to go check out that book.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Would you say, Melissa, and maybe this is secretly, I am like waiting for this goal and this validation. Do you think that people like us, and I say like us because I relate a lot to what you said about kind of being on the fringes of what, society deems normal as far as like morbid curiosity? Because I've always asked my sister, I've always been that way. I'll fall asleep to murder shows, right? And that sounds crazy. It sounds totally insane. But do you think that it's those of us who share that, is there, from your research, from your specialty, does that also maybe perhaps mean that we're more aware of our dark side? We're more in touch with that. We're more maybe overall balanced, if that makes sense. That's what I'm trying to say.
I think so. I absolutely think so. I feel like many of us that are drawn to these types of things, and of course, I always want to be cautious to say there's exceptions. Like, there might be reasons for like a trauma response that we're drawn to certain things. I don't really feel like that's the majority of the time, though. I think that's very few and far between. And even if that is a part of someone's experience for why they're drawn to these things, there's something beautifully healing in that can actually come up for them. But those of us that are drawn to these types of experiences, to look at the dark side of things, that have that, healthy, morbid curiosity and this interest in death and murder, and we do have a healthier outlook because we're not denying, we're not sort of putting on our blinders and saying everything is perfect and wonderful.
Right.
And I really believe that a lot of us, especially the black sheep of the family, I call us the mystical misfits, but
I
a
love
lot of
it.
us tend to be the ones that there's this idea in psychology that the black sheep, even though it's seen as like the outcast, right? The one that doesn't fit in, the one that doesn't belong, psychologically, it's believed that they actually carry the burden of responsibility to create change within generations, within households. So there's something really beautiful about us not fearing these things where we're on the threshold of change. So by looking into dark matters, looking into the hidden parts of things, we end up bringing them to light. And I think of this when relating it to true crime, because if everybody were afraid, right? If everyone were afraid, we wouldn't have people that go after and others and stop crime or try to understand that. We need people that are willing to face the fear, face the uncertainty in order to get closer to bring about change. So I think that we're really the change agents in this unique way. And I think we can celebrate these darker interests in a healthy way because it's bringing about something. It's bringing consciousness to things that are hidden, concealed, avoided. Even in the most grotesque and disturbing situations, there's patterns and themes that we can learn from. So I get a little excited when I meet others who like shared interest, and I'm like, you get it too. I've also seen that a lot of these people have an ability to make connections. They usually see through illusions. They're usually not surface level type people. They're a little more comfortable in asking questions, sinking a little deeper into a topic, a theme. They don't take things at face value as much, which is so incredibly powerful, because when we sort of just stop at the surface, we leave all this territory unexamined. And it
Right.
reminds me of like back in the day when we used to think the craziest things about human behavior and even the anatomy of the body. Like before autopsies were a thing, people made a lot of assumptions about the body and what was happening internally. And some of it was just so bizarre. It's like some of the craziest, weirdest things, but it makes sense because we didn't have a way to look closer yet. We didn't have a way to sort of get inside and understand. And then once we did, we discovered more scientific processes, more psychological processes. And we continue to do that the closer we get into these things that make us really uncomfortable.
That's so
Melissa,
interesting.
how do you, with what you do and in your practice, in your line of work, how do you go about normalizing this quote unquote dark side of people? This, how do you go about convincing, almost, if you will, that this is a normal thing, it's part of everybody, and it's okay to look at that? How do you go about that?
That's a great question, Chelsea.
There's a couple different ways, and it might help for me to kind of set the tone a little bit with, so depth psychology is the lens I tend to look at things through. It's where my training is, it's my background. And depth psychology is one of the many psychologies that believes that we have this thing called the unconscious, that we have this part of us that is beneath the surface of our awareness. And in depth psychology, we follow this model of the psyche. Psyche is the Greek word for soul. And it doesn't mean soul in the literal sense, but it's sort of this organizational field within us that is comprised of a persona, which is kind of like the mask we wear to the world. It's where the outer world and the inner world kind of first meet. It's how we dress, how we present ourselves. But when we sink a little deeper in, then we go to the next layer, which is called the ego. And the ego is a complex within us. It operates on its own. Its job is essentially to keep us alive, to mitigate threat, to make sure that we are safe, that things are brought to our attention if we need to take action, make decisions. The problem, though, with the ego is for a majority of our lives, it's oriented toward the outer world. It's looking at solid, fixed things. It's looking at our identities. It's looking at the role we play. It's how we fit into society, making sure we belong. We're not too weird. We don't stand out. So that's kind of its job in it's believed like the first half of life. But for some of us earlier, we start to notice a shift in that. But when you get past the ego, and think of these as just kind of layers of the psyche itself, this framework of mind, when you get past the ego, you start to get into this territory which is hidden. And it's purposeful. It's under the surface. So the ego plays a role in what we can see. It is what determines what's acceptable about the world and our inner world. So the ego will even shield us from our own things. It will identify with things it wants to be known for. So for example, we might be a jealous person and completely blind to the fact that we're a jealous person because the ego doesn't want to recognize that in itself. Because who wants to think they're a jealous person, right? When we do some work on ourselves, we start to kind of evolve, essentially. We become more aware. We start to catch those patterns. Maybe we start asking different questions. This is when the ego shifts its orientation from the outer world to the inner world. When that happens, we start to go, wow, it's interesting that I get triggered when this subject comes up or when someone's celebrating something or has something I want. Like, I wonder what that's about. And that shifts us from being the jealous person to a little more aware. And all of a sudden, we start discovering the patterns and the cycles and behaviors that are operating that were once sort of in this blind spot, and now they're coming to light. But the issue with it, not issue, the opportunity with this is when you sink even further. Now we get past the ego and this framework of the psyche, and we move into this true self, we might call it. We call it the greater self.
Mm-hmm.
The greater self, part of it is conscious and part of it's hidden. So think of it as like almost this threshold that is, we know some of who we really feel that we are. And there's also parts of us that we don't yet know, parts of our identity that we haven't even experienced. And so that kind of process through the psyche continues and goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And the depth, the farmost part, we could say, is something called the unconscious. And this is out of sight. We have no access to this. It isn't something that you go into and you deliberately can see, sense, or understand. The way we experience this part of us, and also part of the unconscious, I should say, is something that Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist that came up with this model, he determined that part of the unconscious is also something called the shadow self. When we hear that terminology, sometimes it makes us think evil, bad, wrong. All it means is a part we don't know, but we can't directly impact through conscious behavior. But the way that we know it's there is through our compulsions, our impulses, our desires, our feelings. And so when I work with people and I help them kind of start to make peace with the darker side of who they are, I explain to them that not only do you have all of these hidden things within you, but that means you have talent you haven't discovered yet. You have abilities, gifts, skills, amazing, wonderful things that are also in shadow. So my work is to help people attune to this idea so that when there are things that are intense, less desirable, even horrific or tragic, traumatic, that it isn't just a warehouse for pain and suffering or for terrible, scary things. The shadow in itself is neutral. It's not against us. It's not working, operating in opposition to who we are. It contains. So all of this entire model, take with it the idea that it's sort of like a field that's operating within us, just like the mind, right? We can't locate it, but we know it's there. The reason this is important with all of these kind of things is because we all have things within the unconscious. We have things that are operating where that we have protective layers. We would call them complexes. You've probably heard someone say they have a certain type of a God complex or a mother complex. All that means there's something within shadow, within the unconscious, that has, we call it being constellated, which means something is operating there that's directing our behaviors. We can't see it because it's under that threshold.
Right.
And those things come from trauma. I call them impactful moments because it doesn't have, it doesn't always have to be this intense traumatic experience, although it can be. It's also moments that have changed us, an impact of some kind. And then what happens is that impact, it reverberates through the psyche in a way where the psyche is self-regulating. So that's the other great thing. The body has the nervous system as its way of self-regulating, and then the psyche has its way of self-regulating too. What it does is it tries to protect us. So if something like that was painful, an impact, a trauma, what happens is that we call it an energetic charge that's now in the system. It was too much happening, too soon, too big for us to handle, process. So we create the mind, the psyche creates a complex. And it's this little energetic charge that's happening beneath our surface awareness, contained within shadow. We know this is happening because we see it in our behaviors out in the world in response to people. Road rage is an example of this, where somebody's like totally fine, and then the second in like circumstance they're activated. There's hidden complexes there, and because the psyche self-regulating, it's trying to say, hey, something's out of whack. So it's not actually saying this is bad, it's wrong, it's evil, it's dark. It's saying something's out of balance. We've got to look at this. We've got to make it right. If we look at the behaviors within people that are doing terrible things, we can trace and track these things differently as well to say, what's going on? What complex, what series of complexes, what is going on within the psyche that's bubbling up that they are not taught how to deal with? Many of us haven't been taught how to process pain, emotions. We haven't been taught how to express ourselves necessarily. So there's all of this stuff is happening within the hidden part of us. What I do when I work with people is I have a way of asking questions, tracking their emotional charges, so that I say, hey, I noticed when you said that, there was a lot of energy in your voice, or I could tell body language, something changed, or I can hear it in the sound, the tone. And sometimes people will be shocked and go, what do you mean? I didn't even know that was there. And there's also this other belief in depth psychology, in this entire theory of psychology, that we have these blind spots. So again, just like the jealous person that doesn't know they're jealous, there can be the angry person that doesn't know that they come off like a jerk. There can be, different types of, so all of these things are happening. But when we start to remove the idea of this person is evil, this person is that, when we take the judgment away and instead we use discernment, that's a whole other level that opens up for us in this entire dialogue.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think, because Chelsea and I, obviously, this is a true crime podcast. We cover a whole range of crimes, white collar and black collar and red collar and all sorts of things. And I can't tell you how many times, I can't keep track of how many times we get caught up sometimes in that emotional, visceral response to somebody's bad behavior, right? And you want to be like, oh, this person's the worst. They're a monster. They're evil. They're this, they're that. And then, maybe it's because of my duty, right, as a therapist, or maybe it's a habit of kind of taking a step back and we try to say like, well, hold on a second. That may not necessarily be the case. And one thing that we say a lot is, and one thing that I 1000% agree with and believe, is every human is capable of something dark. And I always kind of say, we just haven't encountered our perfect storm yet.
Right.
But every human has that perfect storm. And maybe it's experiences, like you were saying, that peels these layers back. And we're faced with something, right? Maybe a decision, maybe a knee-jerk reaction. And we make a really bad decision, or a painful decision, or a harmful decision. And maybe we've done it more than once, but that doesn't necessarily mean we are evil or we're a psychopath or something like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, another ingredient that kind of helps add context to exactly what you're pointing to is the idea of the ego being fragile. So, the ego catches a bad reputation when it comes to like the personal development field, or some of these different industries that talk about it as if it's this thing we have to get rid of, like, oh, that's egoic, or, but really we need a healthy ego. Because what you're also describing to a degree is when someone has a fragile ego, and there's moments in our lives where we will have a fragile ego.
Right.
When we have a healthy ego, we can handle a little bit of criticism. We can handle a confrontational conversation, right? Somebody saying, hey, you pushed a boundary with me, or you upset me, or we need to talk about this thing. When we have a healthy ego, we can engage without complete defense or animosity or chaos or whatever what else might come
up.
We
won't crumble completely.
Exactly. But when we have a fragile ego, we actually will crumble. It's like we'll shrink within ourselves. Now, this is also where a little bit of like compound trauma and things like that come in, because over time it wears the ego down. It does become very fragile, very sensitive to the inner world, the outer world. We feel so vulnerable. We can feel as if we are a shell of a human being. We might feel like we actually don't even know who we really are. So ongoing abuse, even just narcissistic abuse as well, things like that can really wear the ego down. So let's say we have somebody who had a healthy ego, but then they start to live in unfavorable conditions, or in a partnership that's just really unhealthy for them. And next thing you know, they snap. That's the language we use. They snap. When really what we're not seeing is there's a process that's been happening there. It wasn't just overnight. Even for the people where something seems like from the outer world, when we look at a case or a situation, we go, man, they just really, like, what happened there? They just went off the rails. There's still usually something going on. Like you said, this I think of it as ingredients. It's like the wrong ingredients at the right time.
Yeah.
So that could be the fragile ego. It could also be that particular day there was so much happening that commanded so much attention from that person. If there's a tragedy, a trauma, a loss, those are certain types of triggers that make us way more vulnerable. We've all had that feeling where you woke up and something was just off for the day. And it's almost
Sure.
every encounter you have, every conversation, you're just like, man, I'm just a snot. I'm being a brat. Like, no matter what anybody says. So we have a sense of those things, but imagine that times like 500, right? And then not having the ability to rebound, to reset, to just go back to bed, sleep it off, but you're actually living in a chronic state like that. So there's a lot of different reasons why, but the ego itself and understanding its state of fragility can help us understand more about why someone might have done what they did at that moment in time. If there's a perception also, this is the other thing, is the ego, think of it as perceiving. If we perceive that something was just taken from us, if we perceive that we were betrayed, abandoned, rejected, I call these the core wounds. These core wounds will activate us so quickly. And this is where we come back to that idea of them being an emotional charge. There's usually something there already within the psyche, within the unconscious, that sort of started for that person. It might have been when they were 2 or 6 or 8. In fact, a lot of people, when you see them in their reactive state, if you were to actually have them pause and ask them this question, it'd be so liberating. But the question would be, how old do you feel right now while they're reacting? And it's like, what? Are you kidding me? Because if they're aware enough to go, I feel like I'm 12, or I feel like I'm 6, or I feel, all of a sudden we start to get an idea of the snapshot of what the nervous system is recycling and reproducing from an earlier time or traumatic moment. And then those core wounds are the thing that are sort of the catalyst. So there's 5 of them. And I've kind of put this together. So there's lots of different things that do that. But I feel like these categories kind of summarize a lot for us. So we have abandonment, as I mentioned, rejection, betrayal, humiliation is a big one. We do not like that energy. We don't like that feeling, that sense, right? Shame, guilt falls into humiliation as well. And then the last one is violation. Anything that violates our boundaries, our body, our mind, our belief system. Again, with a fragile ego, we're talking a complete storm now that could possibly be happening. Yeah. But I feel like those ingredients kind of give us an idea of what might be going on. And when you look at the history of some of the criminals or different individuals, there's a story there. There's usually some type of story. Even the ones that had a healthy childhood, that doesn't mean that the ego itself wasn't fragile, right? For different reasons. But yeah, there's so many different ways that we can be triggered and become even just vulnerable to our own compulsions and complexes.
That is fascinating.
Melissa, in your description, you talk about being a certified hypnotherapist. And I don't know if I am making this up or if I saw this in there as well, but you do also like some dream work or dream analysis. Is that,
yes?
Am I correct in saying that?
Absolutely.
Is that something that is that a tool that you keep in a tool belt and you use as needed with your patients? Or is it something that you believe should be utilized across the board?
I don't believe in having a singular approach to anything, because I think we're so dynamic. We are so dynamic. The other thing too is, interestingly enough, I've been a certified hypnotherapist for over almost 2 decades now. And it's something I don't really go to as much because it requires putting someone into an altered state. That's not as crazy or fancy as it sounds. We go into an altered state like all throughout our day. We're going in and out of altered states. If you're driving a car and you kind of like you're driving on the road and you're thinking other things, and then you get to where you're going and you go, oh my gosh, like where was I for that drive?
How did I even get here?
That's an altered state. Yeah. So we go in and out of them all the time. It's not less necessarily like Hollywood where, people are barking like dogs and doing weird stuff. But the point of that is that there is still an altered state, and some people are already living in that dissociated, altered state. And so what I want to do is have them be more integrated with who they are, within the body, not separate from themselves, not disconnected. And so I won't use it as much as I did early on in my work, because I actually want to work with them in other ways. And there's other ways to use hypnosis techniques in order to bring forward information without having to put someone into an altered state, even just by paying attention to all of these other things. So the idea is, in depth psychology, in Jungian psychology, and even in hypnosis, all of them align with the idea of the unconscious. And it's one of the reasons they all blend so well together. And what we can recognize, though, is that the unconscious is always speaking to. It isn't just when we're in an altered state. It isn't just when we're lying on a couch with our eyes closed and, somebody counting down and we're just saying things and speaking from that place. It also happens where we look at the body. So the body reflects the unconscious. The body language, the symptoms of the body are speaking to us. There's a lot of different things that are happening that can tell us and provide information without having to necessarily put someone directly into that altered state. It's rare that I use it now in a traditional sense of having someone lie down and guiding them through process. On occasion, I still do that type of work. Now I pay attention to more of what it is that they're saying and not saying. I use it and to see what's hidden, what's not being spoken. I can detect a shift in someone's voice. I've been working over the phone for over 20 years now. And a lot of my clients or students would be like, why don't you just use Zoom? You can see so much more. But the truth is, my intuition, with my skills, with my training, with everything I've done, I've just been able to sense the shift, the really small, subtle differences in their voice so clearly that when I actually see them, it can be a little bit of a distraction. So that's one of my more go-to tools, is just deeply listening to someone, noticing when they get uncomfortable, noticing when they back off of a subject, when they change a subject. And I don't push, I don't pressure people. I try to become curious. In fact, one of the ways that we work with complexes and these hidden parts of us, the really intense, ugly, dark stuff, is through creativity and curiosity. So a lot of times I'll have people who are healing from just some of these incredibly difficult situations. A lot of it, it's interesting over the years. Now I'm out there with it, like you said, the descriptions of psychopathy and narcissism. But early on in my career, I started just attracting clients who were survivors of the most random, interesting things, like from cults or from, murder-suicide situation, like just really intense things.
Right.
And through talking with them, I realized that I don't want to re-traumatize and have to bring someone right back into the thing that they're trying to heal from. And creativity has been one of the tools. So in a weird twist to all of this, I actually use fairy tales as a way to help people navigate trauma and darkness and shadow, because the original old school fairy tales, they don't leave anything out. When you read those tales, you're going to see contrast and conflict. You're going to hear about dismemberment, death, murder. You're going to also see spiritual things and hear about like animals that communicate and bring gifts. And there's all these random pieces that are not so random when it comes to a fairy tale. And the fairy tale actually speaks to the psyche symbolically. And what I mean by that is, when someone, let's say they're trying to understand a compulsion. Maybe they're an addict, or they have some type of compulsion that they just feel like, no matter what I do, I can't break free of this. I've done the work. I've refrained from trying to use the substance or whatever it is, but the compulsion's not going away. It just kind of changes form. What I'll do is have them do a little research and say, what fairy tale are you drawn to? And go for the dark stuff. Don't go for the airy fairy watered down things. They're not going to contain these rich elements that we really want to work with. I've also done this with psychological thrillers and horror, to have people just read, what are you drawn to? Who are the characters, the figures? Because symbolically, if your psyche is self-regulating, meaning it's always trying to bring you back into balance, the things you're drawn to sometimes are trying to help you understand that as well. And what I found is that when they would be drawn to a certain fairy tale, or I would present a few of them to choose from, And by reading the fairy tale, it gives the person distance from their own situation. They read it as if it's happening to someone else. And it always mimics the journey of the psyche. So in the fairy tale, if the protagonist is going into the woods, that's symbolic of going into the unconscious. If the fairy tale encounters, they're kicked out of the home, the daughter's kicked out of the home, the parents abandon her, reject her, she's no longer welcome there, she's got to go on her own. That's symbolic of an initiation in life, a severance, separation. So there's all these different themes. And by having the client listen to the story and then do some free writing on what's coming up for them, they start to make connections between these parts of them that they didn't know what to do with, that felt separate from them, that were operating like independently, and they can locate something in that story that gives permission for their psyche to reveal a little bit more. And next thing you know, there's that suppressed hidden content that's kind of contained within that shadow starts to make its way up into consciousness without re-triggering, traumatizing, putting them at risk. They can do it through story. And it's been incredible. And I've watched people go through, the loss and death or even murder of a child or grandchild, something just so horrific, and find a tale that it doesn't make it better. It's not about finding purpose, because that's another thing that we can tend to do is dismiss an experience by saying, well, why did this happen? What's the purpose? But we can find meaningful connection and coincidence that offers an opportunity for us to find ways to move forward. Because sometimes that's what it's about. Something is already continuing in the psyche. It's already saying there's unfinished business here. So how can we close that feedback loop? How can we release that tension, that energy, that pattern, whatever it might be? And we can do that creatively in a way. Because the other thing too is when you try to tackle something head on within the psyche, let's say there's a traumatic event, a compulsion, even if it's something as a compulsion to cause harm to other people, if you try to tackle that head on, you're going to be met with an ego's defense. The ego's going to know it doesn't want to change. It thinks it's protecting the person as it is. But if we can creatively navigate that, what we can do is through symbolism, through story. I call it, it's almost like we are in a metaphor sort of a way, we're walking around the ego instead of confronting it head on. So then it softens its defenses. The compulsion, the energy of the compulsion comes up a little bit in the conscious awareness. We're able to recognize a little bit more of the age, the story, the emotion, the unfinished thing, and bring about closure for it.
That I'm just going to keep being like, oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating, because it is. And I hope that this isn't diverting too far off topic, but at least where my brain went kind of in the context of what we're doing, it sounds like perhaps people who, true crime connoisseurs, is consuming true crime almost like that fairy tale for them. Do you think?
Ooh, that's a great question. I hadn't really put that together. I could see that. I do. Well, it's not 100% true. I have considered it, but not in the direct way that you just said it. I do use psychological thrillers and horror as our modern versions of those kind of things, because we don't really have fairy tales happening. It's people are writing stories and they're telling stories, and there are things that we can follow as far as that goes, but it doesn't have the same response as the old school tales do. But we can absolutely do the same thing. In fact, I've been known to give homework to some of my clients to say, go watch your favorite psychological thriller, and I want you to write down, what is it about the characters you're drawn to? Most of them are drawn to the villains. A lot of them are drawn to the villains, and then they struggle with that. They grapple with, like, why am I rooting for the bad guy? Why am I rooting for the underdog? What is this? And I had my own breakthrough doing that type of work, where I didn't realize that all of the really intense psychological thrillers that I was drawn to had the same storyline. It was like a female FBI agent tracking a serial killer. And usually through the story, she had to face certain parts of herself. So that actually mimics the fairy tale in its own way, where the protagonist, the main character in the fairy tale, what she's really doing is psychologically losing and finding herself again through the tale.
Mm.
And in these different thrillers, it's the same kind of a thing. So even facing these psychopathic individuals, like in Silence of the Lambs or something like that, we have Clarice Starling, who's on this journey, and she's got to get this information. She wants to put a stop to this horrific thing that's happening. And yet, what does she have to do? She has to give up some of herself. She has to share some of her story to get what she wants. Psychologically, though, if we look at this symbolically, it's not really about what she's saying to Hannibal Lecter. It's what she's acknowledging for herself to realize there's energy there. There's a pattern there. There's something going on there. So we can do the same thing in movies and stories and in different types of true crime stories. The other thing also is we have this inherent desire to want to feel safe and want to understand. And if we can learn from other people, there's something really powerful in that, in recognizing these different moments, these ways of operating in the world where the instinct, the intuition is guiding us. And there's so many moments in listening to true crime podcasts and different things where I go, oh my gosh, they knew or they sensed it or they felt it. And we hear the moments when someone listened to that. And then we hear the moments when someone wished they would have listened to that. And there's no judgment. It's not about getting it right? It's not about saying, if someone was victimized or hurt, that they weren't doing a good job of listening or something like that. It's not like victim shaming, but we can learn from, these different patterns and go, what are the vulnerabilities here? Fairy tales also show us vulnerabilities. The movies show us, the films show us the vulnerabilities. And then in forensics, we also can see the vulnerabilities too.
Well, one thing that really stuck out to me when you were talking about some of the techniques that you implement in your practice, I really loved this idea of you encouraging personal autonomy and personal ownership within that. We talked with Dr. Elizabeth Loftus I guess a couple of months ago at this point, and she talked about this idea of false memories and how sometimes that can be memories can be what word am I looking for?
Fabrication.
Yes, it can be the result of a therapist essentially like leading you, right? Like coercing you down a path. And so I, for one, am really encouraged to hear that you really put a lot of focus on having them respond to a written text as opposed to I feel like you take the spotlight off of yourself and your own thoughts and your own interpretations. And I, for one, just wanted to say I really appreciate that, because Bailey and I did a whole episode on what should you look for in a good therapist and somebody who will be a good guide for you. So I just wanted to pat you on the back, and I just personally wanted to say that I think that's amazing that you again encourage that autonomy within a person. I feel it's got to be very empowering for a person to themselves have that aha moment, as they're reading it, as they're writing it out, and for you to then be there during that aha moment of this is awesome. Let's talk about that if that's okay. I think what my little guilty pleasure wish is I would love to hear a little bit about your work within dream interpretation, because I have been somebody, and maybe this is super common, but I've been somebody who has been plagued with nightmares my entire life.
Yeah.
Entire life. Like when I was probably 4 or 5, kindergarten, somewhere in that range, I would actually have a sequence of nightmares, and it was the same every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night, in a very specific pattern. And it was always a werewolf one, and then a Medusa one, and then a vampire one. It was all just these kind of fairy tale kind of fantasy type of nightmares. But again, it's been that. It's been, of course, your typical, you're naked in school, people have those. But then dreams of being possessed, just all these crazy, crazy, crazy dreams. And I would love to, like I said, I know that this is kind of guilty pleasure side of me, but I would love to hear a little bit of what you've learned with dream analysis.
Oh, I love this question. This is so great. I love dreams because so through the depth psychological lens again of dream interpretation, dream analysis, we throw away the books. We get rid of the dream text and the symbols that say it means this when you see this, or what we start to do is trust that this dream has been brought to you because your psyche, as part of that self-regulation mechanism, is trying to compensate, trying to bring something back into balance. And the way that it's going to do that is in our dream state. One of the ways is through our dream states. And nightmares are still just dreams. They just usually have an emotional charge to them. They usually have something frightening, a theme that's playing out, that's difficult, that's disturbing, that's uncomfortable. Nightmares also usually have some type of they create what we call somatic response, which is a body-based response. So we can wake up and feel the terror in the body. We can feel sweaty palms or the nervousness, right? So very somatic. This is the psyche speaking to us what we're either not connecting during the day, some type of unfinished business. Now, some will say that nightmares are a trauma response. And I think there's some occasions where that's absolutely true, just the same as I said before about like psychological thrillers, true crime, some of that, anything truly can be a trauma response. But nightmares are unfinished business. And so if we think of it that way, we start to kind of already start to dismantle some of the fear. It's like, well, if we can get away from the literalization of the nightmare, like let's not make it literal, because a lot of people will do that when they have nightmares about death, especially if they see someone they love dying in the dream or themselves. There's fear. And then there's this, oh my gosh. And and if we literalize it, we'll worry then that something's going to happen to that person. It's often metaphorical. It is often symbolic. That doesn't mean it's not deeply intuitive and predictive. It just means that the psyche is going to borrow images to relate to your conscious mind so that you can start to connect the patterns to see what's going on there. So sometimes the images are going to be things that we're well versed in. If you live in a certain part of the world where you have different traditions, cultures, customs, films, what have you, those symbols might show up in your nightmares because they're familiar to you. They're part of who you are, what you know. If you live in a different part of the country, you might not relate to any of those things and may never see them in your own dreams, right? So your psyche is really borrowing different things to try to communicate something to you about this unfinished business. It doesn't speak to us literally, like we have conversation here back and forth, makes sense, full sentences. It's choppy, it's image based, and then there's energy there. When I say energy, there's emotion, there's something that hasn't come to fruition or connected just yet. So themes in nightmares are so powerful. I love to share this really short story about a client experience because it illustrates what I'm kind of talking about here. She was chased for years, and this nightmare, she was just chased over and over by the shadowy figure. And actually, no, in this story, sorry, she wasn't one chased for years. She was chased for a couple of months. There was someone else I was mixing it up with. Her story was for a few months that she had this repetitive nightmare being chased by the shadowy figure. And she woke up with those somatic responses, full on, felt it, made her feel sick. And she didn't know what to do with it. So we started working on the dream. And what I have everybody do is the same kind of a process. Write out as much as you can remember from the dream. Include not just what you saw in the dream itself, but what you felt, what you were aware of, color, texture, tone, figures, people, all the elements, everything you can remember, write it down. Then include, how did you feel when you woke up? What did you notice? Was there sensation on the body? Was your position kind of wonky and weird? Like, what is it that you noticed, right? So paying attention as much as you can, you write it out. I had the client do this, and it took her some time, but over working together for multiple sessions, we were able to get her to confront the shadowy figure. Now, she was one like yourself that had like repetitive kind of a cycle showing up in a dream. So sometimes it's a one-time dream and that's it. We can still work with it after to figure out what's going on. But for those that are kind of experiencing it still, it keeps going. There's definitely something your psyche is trying to get you to see. And so what she did is she used this practice. We call it active imagination. So it is a depth psychological tool. And basically what you do is you take your entire dream that you've written out, and you look for something called the central image. The central image is going to be like the one detail or the first detail that stands out to you the most. Her detail wasn't as much the shadowy figure as it was the movement of being chased. Being chased is what really gripped her. And so that's what you look for, is that first thing is, what did I feel or sense or feel drawn to the most? And sometimes it's different than what the mind wants to tell you it is. Some people like automatically think, oh, it's the figure. We need to focus on them. Why are they after her? No, it was the movement for her. So what I started to get her do was to describe that. What is the movement? What does it mean to be chased? Where are you going? If you were to imagine, where were you going? So we did that kind of a dialogue through different sessions. And then finally, she decided to engage with the active imagination process, where she imagined that the shadowy figure was in front of her sitting in a chair. And this is sort of like a visualization type of a thing. And what you do is you have a little notebook and you have a pen, and you just close your eyes and you just imagine that that figure is right there and that you're talking to it. Why are you chasing me? What are you trying to tell me? Am I running from something? I don't get it. And the point of doing this, it sounds silly, and it's really hard for people to do because they have an issue with pretending. They think they're being silly. They think it's nonsense. What you're doing, though, is you're sinking a little deeper into those unconscious, unknown sort of parts. You're giving it a form. So active imagination takes all the hidden stuff and it gives us something physical to project onto, like a canvas. So when you're imagining, you're giving the canvas, right? So she did that. And anyhow, the whole thing came about that she was able to detect that this figure that was chasing her was trying to show her that she was running in her daily life. She wasn't listening to her intuition. She then had a follow-up dream, and in the dream we would call this almost like lucid dreaming. She was aware enough to turn around and stop, because that was my other part of the guidance. Like, what would happen? What's the worst that would happen if you turn around and you let yourself be caught? And I wouldn't recommend that to everyone, especially if there's some
depends on
layers around that. But there wasn't for her. This was a completely ominous, random thing for her. So she stopped, she turned around, she confronted the shadow, and she said it was almost like a cloth, like turned a cloth, like a black, like robe or cloth that like hit the ground, kind of dissolved. And when she looked down at her feet, a fox curled up at her feet, this little like furry fox. And so she wrote that down. And when she then engaged with the fox, she realized she was denying her instinct. To her, not because of a dream book or, something else. Her, when she looked at the fox, she was like, this is my instinct. This is the instinctual part of me. Here it is. It's curled up at my feet because I'm not running from it. I'm not turning away. I'm not trying to escape. Because she did that, then from there, we started to talk about, what is your instinct? What is your intuition? What is it trying to say to you? If you were to just make it up, here's the most amazing part. She had been invited into this business opportunity decision thing by someone she knew. It was like a group or whatever, people that she knew. And when it was presented, it was like this massive opportunity. It was like life-changing financial kind of a thing. And she was so excited about it. And there were a couple little red flags, though, but her excitement was overriding the red flags. This is why the dream started. The dream started because she wasn't listening to her intuition. She was going with what her head wanted. After this process of working with this dream, she realized, I need to sit with this longer. She let the people know, I just need to sit with this. I need to see how I feel. And which was huge for her, because a lot of people, we don't know how to do that, right? If we're people pleasers, we don't have healthy boundaries. She was able to do that. And ultimately it came down to, this isn't the right decision because something felt off. She couldn't name it. She had no idea what it was. And when we can't name something that feels off, we see this all the time with narcissism, with psychopathy, with individuals that just make us uncomfortable. We don't know why. Their face is normal. They look like they're charming, charismatic, but we just feel unsettled. We can't name it. So sometimes we want to tamper that down. She was doing the same thing. Because she gave herself this opportunity to be with these feelings, feel into it, think about it, work with these different processes creatively, she realized it's just not for her. She had to trust herself, which was hard. So she said no. they were disappointed. It caused a little bit of a stink in their, the relationship and the whole thing. And then a few months later, the whole thing had crumbled, and she found out that there was all of this hidden stuff within it. And it actually, instead of it helping her financially the way she would have, was promised or how it was presented to her, it would have ruined her financially.
Oh,
Her
wow.
instincts were trying to protect her. The shadowy figure that was chasing her wasn't trying to hurt her. It was trying to actually get her to pay attention. So nightmares, I say, are unfinished business. There's something there. And if we can get away from the literal, the part of us that wants to be like, this is dangerous, it's scary, it's whatever, and we can start to look at the symbolism, we get a different picture. Symbolically, what is death? Change, transformation. Symbolically, what is a vampire? You mentioned vampire, Medusa, these different figures. Well, vampire can mean many different things, but what's interesting about a vampire is there's an energy of like taking, being drained, resources maybe being drained, or, we can play around with these things, and you'll know when it's for you, because just like we have the emotional charge in the dream, your body or something in your mind will resonate. And it's like somebody ringing a bell. All of a sudden, when you hear the right thing at the right time, you can't unknow it. And you go, I don't know why, but when you said that, there's something to that.
It is, right?
That's it. That's how I work with the nightmare. So we don't always logically know, but the psyche knows, and we trust that process. We trust the body to reveal more, and we trace these different symbols and patterns of movement. We remove the idea that they're literal, and we start to look at them symbolically and go, what is this being chased? Even I had somebody, the same thing with dismemberment in her dream, and she realized she felt like she was being cut to pieces in her daily life. There wasn't enough time. There wasn't enough energy. There wasn't enough of her to go around. And her dream was trying to show her this. But when she got past the initial like disgust and, feeling really disturbed, she was worried. She's like, is there something wrong with me or my mind that I was like, in fact, your psyche is so creative. It's giving you a very specific graphic image to work with to show you so clearly what's going on. We just have to release this idea that there's something wrong with us.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay for us to have intrusive thoughts. It's okay. I mean, of course, we want to be in touch with that and find support or help as we're navigating different depths of those types of thoughts. But most of us have these images or these thoughts on a regular basis, and it's this communication from the psyche. So if we stop labeling it as or judging ourselves, like there's something wrong with us. Oh, we're so dark or, evil or disturbed. It's like, what if you were just so incredibly potent and rich in your symbolism, and you can really establish this beautiful connection with this hidden part of you? All of a sudden, darkness takes on different meaning, and it starts to feel more like this space of incubation instead of frightening unknown. And it's quite magical.
You really, Melissa, you have a gift. You do. You have a gift for being able to make something so historically scary and ominous to be something that we should be grateful for and something that is positive and helpful. And I love that, and I appreciate that so much, because I really do think it is a gift to be able to do that, because I've never heard it explained. The only other time that I have felt this way of like, oh my gosh, like what a great representation, was in Inside Out, whenever Joy had her moment and she said, oh, sadness is such a beautiful emotion and it is absolutely necessary to have a fulfilled, wonderful life. It's like you're like your own version of Inside Out, explaining things to people.
I have to go watch that now, because you are the third person that's referenced
It's so good. It's so good. I'd be so curious to hear your perspective, and arguably Inside Out 2 is even better than the first one, because there's even more that goes into that. And I do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I'm totally flexible. Yeah.
Awesome. So I first, thank you for the whole nightmare thing, because Chelsea and I have both had really bad nightmares for as long as we really can remember. And so that was appreciated. One of the, maybe my Chelsea got her kind of secret burning desire question. I think kind of one of my secret burning desire questions is kind of going back to, darkness isn't bad, and I'm going to run with that, is infatuation with, I've always been infatuated with murder and darkness and grim and grotesque and serial killers and all the things. I'm not infatuated with serial killers as people, right? That I want to be super clear about that. And I think most people are not. They're not like, I love this human being. They're just infatuated with, this is such a different construct of the human brain, and we don't really know what to do with that. And so we had interviewed a forensic psychologist, and he kind of went through this whole like sociopaths versus psychopaths, and it was much more literal as far as like brain structure and research around it. And I'm just curious, outside of actual brain structure, from the depth psychology angle, is there differences in the layers in the psyche, how, the Pandora's box in killers and serial killers versus kind of the quote unquote average human? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, it does. And, of course, I don't think my opinion's the end all be all. And there may be lots of disagreement. And I have lots to learn, too, as I'm continuing this journey. What I would say from today, just from the research I've done, and I have a very same type of similar curiosity. In fact, I used to feel so guilty and so much shame because I started studying these individuals at a really young age. I had 2 serial killers in the area where I grew up, and I didn't know. I just had these feelings. I had these intuitive thoughts. I would actually play this game in my backyard. I lived in the woods. I was on the edge of this strange area. It's been in movies, and there's all of these weird, it was in this magazine called Weird New Jersey, where I grew up, where people were afraid of this road. It was considered haunted. It was considered to have all these terrible, weird things. And there was some truth to that. There were body parts and different things that were found on this road. As a kid, I didn't know this logically, but I would play this game. I would go in my backyard and I would try to corral the other neighborhood kids with me. And I would want to dig and play detective. And I was convinced I was going to find a dead body. I don't know where that came from. I started at a really young age doing that, 5, 6, 7 years old. Sure, I watched a lot of like weird things too. And, it's possible there's layers of influence there. But the reason that I'm sharing this is because I had this I had this strange feeling, like it was almost like an impulse, like dig here, move here, do this. And none of it ever made sense. Then one day my mother sat me down. I was about 15 or 16. And by this time I had already, I don't even know if you guys have ever heard of this, but there used to be this card deck, and it was a serial killer card deck. And I had this thing and I was like 15 or 16. No idea where it came from, but it was all facts about each one of them. And I would just find myself in that state of exhilaration, like, what is this? And absolute terror, like, how could someone? And what I realized is when I also would dig in the woods, the same feelings were present. What am I going to find under here? This is so exciting. And oh my God, what am I going to find under here? There could be snakes, there could be whatever, there could be a foot. I don't know. So my mother sat me down and she was like, listen, she saw me getting involved with people and things. And I always had this dark side and curiosity, morbid things like that. And she was like, I need you to be careful. And I'm going to tell you that, they found body parts on the road, off the side of the road, this crazy road that I grew up on. We were the last house on this road. There were no cell phones at the time. If there were car accidents, people would come to our house to use the phone. People would come to our house covered in glass and blood. Like, it was intense. So she's like, there were these body parts that were found. There was a serial killer called the Iceman, and he operated in New York City. He was convicted of, I think it was 5 murders, but responsible for over 200 deaths. And body parts were found from one of the murders just a few miles from my house, and on one side of this road. Well, the other thing is my mother's friend, one of her best friends at the time, her brother was one of the victims also of this individual, and they found him in a hotel room underneath a bed. And he was also, the victim was also started to get involved in gang type thing and mafia, which all of this was kind of connected to. So she tells me this, and I just remember this validating, strange feeling of my interest in things. Instead of her telling me this and it scaring me, I just got even more interested. Like, what do you mean they
Right.
found? What is this? I got in trouble when I was in like 5th or 6th grade, maybe even younger than that, because I brought an article to school about them finding a leg in the river on the other side of the street I grew up on. And that was from a different serial killer. His name was Joel Rifkin. Uh,
Wow.
and so I brought that into school because we were doing show and tell. And I'm thinking, I'm bringing in this article and I'm, sharing this thing because I was fascinated by it. And I didn't understand that could cause fear or terror to children or other people. I didn't even have
Sure.
it in my framework of my mind, So of course the teacher had to have a little chat with my mom, and I wasn't allowed to bring stuff like that to school. But the reason I'm sharing this is it was a validation of all of these different things. And I just had this interest and I wanted to understand, which led me years later to the work I do now. And the one thing I just want to say around that piece is I do feel like outside of the structure of the brain, we look at this idea of the psyche. In the unconscious, we have this other part called the collective unconscious. And this is where these symbolic themes, all of us relate to these different themes. For example, if I said to you the word mother as an archetype, you would understand what that means. Now, we might have different mothers. There's loving mothers, there's terrible mothers, but you get the general sense of the idea mother.
Right.
All of
Right.
us at a fundamental level are connected to the collective unconscious, this hidden part of us that resonates with these themes and ideas. What I feel to be true around all of this is that when we have someone who is a sociopath, there's a belief that they have been conditioned versus born that way. And what I think to be true is that they have a more fragile ego because of what was worn down over time, how they were made, so to speak. And therefore, because the ego is so fragile, imagine you have a vessel in the ocean. If that vessel is filled with holes, the water is going to seep in, right?
Right.
It's going to eventually sink. The ego itself starts to crumble. And what happens is, imagine that it's this energetic structure that starts to fall down into the unconscious. It's at the whim of all these other psychological patterns, all of these other things, all the compulsions, all the primal reactions and instincts, death, murder, destruction. It's so much more susceptible to those types of behaviors because it's been sort of made that way. A psychopath on the other side of that isn't necessarily believed to have been made, but born with something wrong with them. I think they too, in a different way, have a very fragile ego. And when the ego is so fragile and very permeable, like it doesn't have structure to it, we don't really know who we are. If we don't really know who we are, we can be completely dissociated from the true self, from the soul. Because with psychopaths on a spiritual level, there's always this question of, do they have a soul? Do they not have a soul? What I feel is that the ego has been consumed by the unconscious. There is no sense of self. There is no conscious. There is no desire to operate through healthy needs, having morals and ethics and all these. It's just completely at the whim of behavior, of instinct, of impulse. There isn't this engagement of empathy and connection in the same way. The other reason I think that this is really important is because those of us that are drawn to these things, just to kind of get back to that first part of your question, is that I've worked with so many people on this, and they'll say the same thing. I'm drawn to these individuals, studying these individuals, watching their behavior. What is wrong with me? I have a huge heart. I'm a very kind person. I do a lot of good in this world. There are a lot of therapists, counselors
Yeah.
that are like decompressing at night, watching true crime. They're like, what is wrong with me? Here's something interesting that I found. Some of them are so deeply connected to how others feel. They have so much empathy. They're usually highly sensitive individuals. They're usually what they would call empathic. They feel other people's feelings so deeply. The idea of a serial killer to them, not consciously, I don't think this is conscious. I think it's part of what they're drawn to, the impulse to watch, to learn.
Almost like they wish they had a little bit more of that.
Yes, the ability to, oh my gosh. I had a client actually say to me, for once, I just wonder what it would be like to not feel so much. And when she said that, it was that ringing of the bell, right? I couldn't unring what I felt. And I went, there's something there. There's a piece right there in that attraction to those figures. So remember, if the psyche is self-regulating and it's bringing us in the balance, we are also going to be drawn to certain things that we can learn from, that we can study, that we can observe, to kind of find our middle ground. Now, obviously, we're not going to just start causing harm to people or go off rails and be that type of individual, but we can study the habits and patterns of behavior to go, okay, maybe where am I too conscious, meaning carrying the burden of responsibility for everyone and everything. And what would it feel like for just a minute to be so unhinged and so authentic in who I am and not give a shit about what anybody else thinks or feels? There's something a little appealing there. And I think it's hard for us to admit that sometimes. And I don't think that's the only thing. But anyway, I apologize. That was a really long answer.
No. It was awesome. I mean, and it makes so much sense because, you know, arguably, I'm a therapist, right? I'm a very empathetic person, but I mean this in a positive way, but I used to be much more empathetic and much more porous and boundaryless, right? It's taken a lot of heartache, a lot of therapy, a lot of just life skill to be able to have boundaries. And, you know, one of the, I don't know if appealing is the right word, but like one of the things that crazy psycho killers do well is they're dismissive, right? They don't give a shit about your boundaries. They don't give a shit about what is a priority in your life. So exactly what you were saying, it's like, if there was a leaf to take out of that book, being a super overly sensitive, you know, kind of person, it's being able to be a little bit more, if that bothers you, that's okay. You're allowed to be bothered, right? I get to say no, and I get to have peace with my day and doing what I want to do. You know what I mean? Like, that's at least kind of what my brain put together after hearing what you were saying.
One other piece I'll just add on to that just came to me now as I was listening to you, is also a lot of us tend to be very deep. We tend to be very deep feeling people. And we know that when we see human behavior like that, it can't possibly be just as simple as they had a bad day or they're evil. So there's something about our depth, which can sometimes lead us to feel misunderstood, which can lead us to sometimes feel a lot of different things for different reasons. There's something about monsters, criminals, the misunderstood, that is appealing because our own depth and our own inability to be seen, to be appreciated for who we really are, there's something about that gets projected on others who are just so in the spotlight for some crazy, unruly thing they did, where we know there's so much more to that person. And there's sort of this interesting mirroring of depth, not necessarily we're the same, not necessarily even just about our capacity to do harm or any of that, but more of there's something that meets us in the depth of recognizing patterns, cycles, other potentials that are beneath the surface of that person that I think feeds our own depth that we walk around with every day. Because especially today, society, the way things are with technology and everything else, there's a lot of superficial level engagement. And I don't say that to be dismissive, because there's a lot of beauty in that. There's a lot of great things that have come about with technology, but sometimes it allows us to have these really brief interactions that skim the surface. We don't really have as many deep conversations. So there's something about true crime that I feel like kind of fills a void also in a little bit, where it gives us that stimulation of mind, intuition. We use our skills. We're feeling with the body. We're thinking. We're so deeply engaged. And what is this? How could this happen? All of these things. I think it feeds a lot of us that we may not have either access to consciously, or we may not be able to interact with. Especially, I notice this in my clients. A lot of the women that are, it just tends to be a lot of women that are drawn to true crime.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of them feel unfulfilled in their careers. And so this is their decompression, or and not, I don't want to say entertainment, because that's not it. That's very dismissive, and it sounds like it's glorifying. It is an entertainment. I know it's used that way sometimes, but it's one of the ways they get to use this other part of them that they know exists, that maybe they don't get to bring to their work or to their family or something else. So, and I know for me, that's been so enriching to be able to have that and to be able to listen to something and make connections, or to watch a series, a documentary unfold and have these deeper knowings and insights. That to me can be very fulfilling. And I used to have a hard time admitting that, to say, sometimes I feel really seen in a weird way when I hear something that was done. I can maybe go, yeah, I could see going off the rails that way too, being misunderstood, not appreciated. We have a lot of, there's three things I talk about around this. One is suppression, when we are consciously pushing things down within us. We don't want to think about, we don't want to feel, we don't want to deal with. Then there's repression, which happens automatically. The psyche does it for us, just holds information, content down. We're not even aware that it's happening. And then there's oppression, which comes from the outside. It's usually other people's beliefs, thoughts, society, government, what have you. And so all of that is going on. And so there's something about engaging with true crime stories, case files, that allows us to sort of be free of those constraints and that ego societal box that's trying to put us in of what's acceptable, what's not. And it's a little edgy to be drawn to those things. So I think there's a lot going on there for sure.
Well, I am walking away from this feeling so much more fulfilled and understanding and having so much more insight. And this has been arguably one of the coolest conversations that we've had here on our platform, and probably one of the coolest conversations I've had in many, 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 many years.
Wow, that means a lot. I just have to say, I was so afraid of all of the things that I'm sharing today. I was so afraid of all of these parts of me, and I never thought they'd be valuable. I never thought they'd be interesting. I thought there was something wrong with me. So to come full circle and to have other people, I get to meet the most incredible people in the world and just be like, oh, you too, and we resonate and we connect.
Yeah.
It means so much to me to receive that feedback, because for so long I hid this part of me, which is probably what drew me to want to expose or understand the hidden parts of other people.
Right.
And so thank you so much for sharing that.
Of course, you're very welcome.
You guys are great. It's so fun. You're doing meaningful work, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I love that you kind of highlighted that so many of people who feel that way either naturally end up, or maybe by chance, even if they think it's by chance, end up in some sort of mentoring, therapy, things like that. Because I know, Bailey and I talk about that a bunch, because like I'm involved in a mentoring program at the high school. And I was talking to my daughter about it one day on something that, some things that were said to me. And we're just kind of talking over it. And she looked at me and, actually, I take that back. She was having a meltdown. That's what it was. She was having a meltdown over something that was going on. And she was just so upset. And she kind of didn't want to tell me, because she was like, I just didn't know how you would respond. I mean, just your typical, 14-year-old thought process. And I just was like, it's okay. And I always love you. And I'm here for you, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of her just melting down, she was like, is this why you do mentoring, Mom? Because it doesn't scare you when people tell you crazy stuff, And I'm like, maybe that is kind of why it is. Because again, like when you realize it, when you see that, and number one, like you said, you're not scared of it. And number two, not only are you not scared of it, you're kind of like, oh, actually, ooh, pray tell me more about this. This is very dark and interesting. But I love that you, again, kind of give this normalization to it. Not only can it be a healthy thing, but also, like you said, embracing that, taking that and carrying that with you, and then being like, how can I better the world around me by being somebody who's like, I see that and it's okay, and that's safe here. Like, I see that in you. It's okay that you are bringing that to me, because, hey, yeah, it's kind of weird, isn't it? Kind of creepy. And I love that. I love that you give this sense. And like you said, it's not dismissive. It's not like, yeah, it's weird. We don't, whatever. We'll talk about the psychology behind it. But like, no, it is. It's a valid thing. And there are some valid aspects to this. And like Bailey said, for one, I feel very, even though this was not about me, I feel very personally validated, because I'm like, I'm not alone. It's okay to like weird stuff. But I again appreciate the science and the psychology behind it, because I think sometimes without that aspect of it, it is kind of left with less weight. Like when you can't put the psychology behind it, for me, that's where I really like to say, like, that does make sense. It makes sense on intuition and being more vulnerable, and that is a process, like you said. I mean, I feel like maybe it's something that was naturally there, but if you kind of lean into that, it can develop into something that is a very positive, very benevolent thing.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's been incredible. And I'm sure that there's 1,000 more things that we could even talk about under this umbrella. And maybe sometime next year, if you're game, we'll have you back on and we'll continue. We'll have a conversation version of breaking through these layers of psyche, right? Like we'll just kind of do more and get deeper as we go along.
I would love that. I have a book coming out next year, which might be a nice way to kind of like tie that in. It's like it's a huge process. It won't be out till fall of like 2025. So that would be fun to like maybe do something around that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Melissa, because I really almost feel guilty because we didn't really get around to you being an international bestseller. And so if there are any books that you could plug kind of here towards the end, I for one would love to know what those are. And then also, like you said, what you're working on. And maybe once you get a new release out, we can, or even just another episode where we can talk about your books. I think that would be awesome. I, for one, would love that.
Yeah, I'm kind of, I don't know, a little embarrassed to say this, but I would say that a lot of the books I wrote in the past were so different from the material I'm working with now. So the one that's coming out is really going to be like the heart of it all. Some of the other ones, I'm proud of them. They're wonderful, but they don't have the same depth that I would put out at this point, I would say.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so it's probably better to say like the newer content though, and things I'm sharing around psychopathy and the narcissism and nightmares and all that stuff. I have articles and things I've written on my website. That might be a better.
Awesome. And we can include that in the show notes. And will you also be able to provide, like, if there's a way that somebody wants to get in touch with you, either to see if you're taking new clients or to ask you a couple of questions, is that something you could provide that we could put in the show notes as well?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll make sure to do that. And listen, we've taken up way too much of your time, and I'm so super grateful that we've gotten through. Melissa and I have been phone tagging or Facebook tagging for months, and we've canceled and rescheduled, and mostly me because I had a bunch of stuff come up from work, but you've been an absolute gem, and I so appreciate the work that you do and who you are and your voice and your advocacy, and it has been an awesome, awesome adventure here with you today.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for your time and energy, for what you guys are doing. And it's always an honor to be able to show up and share and have great conversations. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Hopefully we can say see you later and not goodbye. Hopefully
Until
we
next
can
time.
do until next time. Hasta luego, because like I said, I would really, really love to do a part 2 of this. So until then, Melissa, again, thank you. This is amazing. I feel like I have a whole new probably hobby that I'm going to be looking into, and that will be your website
absolutely.
and your articles. So until next time, Melissa, thank you so much. And like always, Wildsiders, we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators. Hey, Wildside Tribe, don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildside Podcast.
Make sure to tune in on Wildside Wednesdays. New episodes will drop each Wednesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
We would love to hear from you, so if you have a wild case recommendation, email us at wildsidepodcast@gmail.com. That's wildside with a C. Or share your thoughts in the comments below. As always, if you haven't heard it today, you're loved, you're worthy, and you're valuable. And we'll catch you on the flip side.